My name is John Calvert, and I'm an adjunct professor at Simon Fraser University. And I've had an interest in BC hydro and electricity issues for a number of years in the province. And most recently, I was on the Provincial Integrated Energy Task Force that has just concluded its deliberations. So I have a bit of background in this area. I am very concerned about what's been happening to BC hydro and to our public electricity system. And we're facing a situation that is one in which the province's energy plan, which came out in 2002, has mandated first that BC Hydro can no longer build new generation for the public, with a couple of small exceptions, and that all new energy that we're going to need in BC is going to come from private sources, and much of that will come from what are called independent power producers, or as I would call them, private power interests. The concerns that I have are that if you go back historically, the reason that we have what's probably about the cheapest energy in North America, if not the world, and here in BC, is that we made some very significant investments in the 60s, 70s, and into the early 80s to build new hydro generation. And at the time, they were expensive investments. But if you think about the impact of inflation over that period of time and think that we're paying energy prices now based on the cost of production back in the cost of those investments back in the early 1970s, early 1980s, you can see that prices were much lower then than they are today. And as a consequence, and because we are charging ourselves what it costs us to produce energy rather than what the California market, for example, would provide, we are able to continue to enjoy this very cheap electricity, which is beneficial not only for residents, but also in terms of economic development within BC. And it's one of our big comparative advantages. What has happened as a result of the province's energy policy, or the energy plan as it's called, is that instead of investing ourselves in energy production for our own future, the province is encouraging private interests to gradually supplant the public sector and supplant BC Hydro. It's made a whole range of decisions over time that are having the effect, cumulatively, of privatizing our electricity system. And it's true that the government says that they're not actually privatizing BC Hydro, but this is basically quite misleading, because you don't need to privatize the entity or the corporation called BC Hydro to effectively privatize the electricity system. And we've seen, for example, that there was a major carve-out of about a third of the workforce of BC Hydro to the private firm Accenture about 3 years ago. So a third of their employees now are no longer with Hydro, they're with this private company called Accenture. And the government says that's not really a fundamental privatization of BC Hydro, but I think one could argue that a third of Hydro is already privatized as a result of that decision. Beyond that, what's happening is that BC Hydro is being reconfigured so that rather than serving the public as it has done in the past, increasingly it's being used to serve private interests in the province, and the interests particularly of the private power industry. One of the great advantages of our public electricity system, BC Hydro, is that we have among the lowest, or if not the lowest, price of electricity in all of North America. Prices in New York, for example, are for a megawatt of energy delivered at the door are about $288 roughly. In San Francisco, something like $230. In BC, about $60, which translated into what you see on your normal bill is about 6 cents a kilowatt hour. Now, the thing is that also we have not experienced huge price fluctuations. For example, as they have done in California, there was a period in California a couple of years ago where people were paying $1,000 a megawatt, which would be close to 15 times more than what we're paying here in BC. BC Hydro, as our provincial public utility, has been a vehicle for not only lower prices, but also for creation of jobs, economic development within the province. And it's been the basis also for a lot of small business development, especially in the regions. And we're now in a situation with the current government with its energy plan where much of this now is being dismantled. We're seeing, for example, that a third of the corporation's employees were carved out and reassigned to this company Accenture, which used to be Arthur Andersen. And in the past, there were connections, as many of you are aware, between Arthur Andersen and Enron and so on. In addition, the government has carved out the transmission system into what's called the BC Transmission Corporation. So that element of what was BC Hydro is now also separate from the company. And there are a lot of concerns about what will happen with the transmission system down the road and whether this is a first step to further privatization of that part of BC Hydro. The basic point is really quite simple, though. The government does not need to sell or privatize BC Hydro as a corporation in order to privatize the electricity system. And in effect, what they are doing is privatizing the electricity system in BC. Most people, when they hear about energy or electricity in BC, they think about BC Hydro. And the government says, we're not privatizing BC Hydro, but the reality is they're privatizing everything around it, and they are reconfiguring BC Hydro in a way that fundamentally transforms its earlier public policy purpose into essentially a handmaiden of private interests in this province. And that's what we're now seeing. And one big element of that is that the corporation, BC Hydro, is no longer allowed to build new generation as they did in the past. The reason we have such low-cost energy in BC is that we made investments as part of the public back in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s to build new generation facilities, the big dams, as you know, in the Columbia and Peace River, and all the transmission infrastructure. And at the time, that was an expensive investment, but we own that investment, and we now charge ourselves prices for electricity based on our cost of production, not on the California market, not on the West Coast market, but what it actually costs us here in BC to produce the energy. The government's policy is to transform this into a market-driven electricity system in which we will pay market prices, and eventually we will pay California prices, because the market goes down the coast all the way to California, and as you know, we have shipped energy down there, and we can buy and sell energy back and forth across the border regularly. So the prospect, if we have an energy market, of paying California prices is very real down the road for us, and we have to be very concerned about that, because that's the direction the government wants to take us. The thing that we have to also be concerned about is the privatization of the system through what's called the energy plan, which is the government's approach to electricity policy now, is that all new generation essentially will be private. And the government has done a whole range of different things to try and help private interests become major players in our electricity system. One of the things, of course, is the ban on BC Hydro actually building any new generation for us. But another part of that has been the encouragement of what are called independent power producers, or private energy interests in the province, through a variety of different but interlocking policies. For example, there are now about 450 applications for run-of-the-river projects around the province. Run-of-the-river is small hydro. Basically, you put a small powerhouse and maybe a tiny dam or a pond to collect the water, and you generate energy from the fall in the water in the river. This type of small hydro is very popular with a lot of environmental groups, understandably, but it is based on our water resource. And our water resource is a very important and very valuable resource. The province, however, seems to take the view that the water resource is essentially something analogous to a free good. Unlike, say, oil and gas, where we see this as a resource that generates very significant provincial revenues, with respect to water, the province's view is that we should essentially give it away at very low cost to whoever wants to apply for a water license to build a power generation facility. And that is precisely what is now happening. If you look at the cost of getting a water license and the cost per megawatt of revenue to the province for the water that is attached to that license, you find that we're essentially getting peanuts. We're getting very, very small amounts of revenue from a very, very rich resource. Let me give you quickly some financial information that will help you understand this more clearly. The current price of electricity that BC Hydro is purchasing runs in the vicinity of about $55 a megawatt hour. The water license rental fee that the province charges private interests who are generating energy is $1 for a small project and up to a maximum of $5 for quite a large project. Yet, when BC Hydro is purchasing energy from these projects, we, the public, through BC Hydro, are paying approximately $55 a megawatt hour for the energy. So there's an enormous spread. So instead of getting a very substantial return on this very valuable resource, we're essentially allowing those who are able to acquire water licenses, those firms, to make enormous windfalls from this, the sale of this water. One of the things the government has done to promote its private energy agenda has been to get BC Hydro to provide a whole range of different kinds of supports to the private sector. I mentioned earlier about the energy purchase agreement arrangement in which BC Hydro gives a long-term contract which effectively finances the capital costs of these new projects and for which we get no assets. But Hydro has also been asked and has been very active in doing a whole range of other activities in support of the private sector here. One of the things they did a couple of years ago was to commission a report from a major engineering and consulting company to review all of the potential run-of-the-river sites around the province and to provide cost estimates and other estimates around the potential revenues, distance from existing power lines, the need for new roads, a whole range of factors involved in building one of these projects. So what effectively the public has paid for is kind of like a template in which all of the opportunities are laid out there for private investors to come and take, essentially. I would argue that a water license is almost like a license to print money, because if you think about the flow of water as really being a revenue flow, that's what it is when you build a power project. And when you think that the province is charging $5,000 for a small project and $10,000 for a larger project, in the context of a project maybe getting 10 or 15 or $20 million of annual revenue, the amount that we're paying, that the proponents are paying to the government for those licenses is literally peanuts. It's infinitesimally small in relation to the future value of the energy that's going to be produced, the future revenue stream that comes from that water. Now, a water license that's sold for $10,000 to a proponent, if you think about what it's really worth, and if the proponent sells it to somebody else, we're looking at millions and millions of dollars of value, because that water license conveys with it the ability to acquire that revenue stream. And that revenue stream is worth an awful lot of money, in some cases tens of millions a year. And so the idea that we would sell this revenue stream for essentially peanuts seems to me to be almost incomprehensible in terms of the public interest. How can this be done? How can we sell something that's so valuable and will be valuable long after our oil and gas licenses are over, and long after the oil is long gone in this province and the gas is exhausted? The water will still be running, and that means the money will still be running to all those investors who have now bought into this industry. And who will be paying for it? You and I, members of the public, because we're the ones who are going to pay the energy bill. We're going to get that bill every month, whether it's from BC Hydro or God knows, maybe some other private company down the road if the government keeps on going the way it is, and we'll pay that. The money going to the investors is not coming out of thin air, it's coming out of somebody's pocket. I'm not personally opposed to significant numbers of run-of-the-river projects being built, or some run-of-the-river projects, if there's a proper trade-off between the environmental costs and community costs, and on the other side, the public benefits in terms of revenue, in terms of having still public control because it's still publicly owned, and so forth. But at the same time, whatever is done in this area should be done in a very planned and thoughtful way, with proper input from the communities and First Nations, and in a manner that ensures that we're able to see the overall effect. And then we make decisions that reflect a proper balance between the needs that we have for energy, for electricity in the public here, and the need to maintain community values and community use of the river systems. Now, one of the big problems of what the government is doing is that by opening the grid, the government is encouraging exports. When you think that all of these projects do damage the river systems to some degree, and they do have negative impacts on the community, and yet provide virtually no benefits, what is the benefit then to the public of encouraging large-scale exports of energy when we're generating in this way? The balance that you want is that you need more energy perhaps for people who live in BC, and there are some costs associated with that, and you try and match those two in a reasonable way through a proper public process. When you export the energy, what you're doing is shunting all the costs onto the community, but not giving any comparable benefit either to the public or to the community. So the idea that we would encourage energy exports, especially when we get so little revenue, so few jobs, so few benefits, doesn't make any sense from an economic development point of view or from the viewpoint of the interests of the public here in BC. And yet that is precisely what the government's policy is encouraging. It has changed the whole issue of access to the grid, partly by carving out the transmission system and creating a separate company, partly through an ongoing negotiating process that they're having with what's called Grid West, which is a Pacific Northwest energy network dominated by American and mainly private energy companies, so that our grid would eventually become integrated and perhaps managed by a new entity over which we would have very little say, which would be determining where new transmission would be going, and what capital would be invested in different parts of this province for our energy in terms of transmission issues. So we have a government that's encouraging energy exports, but which doesn't seem to comprehend that in doing that there's huge costs to people in BC and very little in the way of benefits. And if they had not been opening up the grid, if BC Hydro were in charge of the construction and operation of these facilities, we would own it. We could make the right trade-off between community values and our own energy needs, and we would not be vulnerable in terms of exports. The issue, let me put the issue of exports in a different way. When we have energy that we own through BC Hydro, we are in a position then to say this energy will be sold exclusively within BC. Now, it's true we engage in some energy trading with Alberta and with Washington State and so on, but we do that on the basis of mutual benefit, and we control what we do. We're not forced to. We're not forced to export if we choose not to. We can do that as it makes sense from our point of view. When the energy is owned by private interests, we don't have that control at all. They're free to export it. Even if we need it here in BC, they're still free to export it, and will do if people in California are prepared to pay higher prices than we are, then they will export it to California. Or if we want to keep it here, we'll have to pay prices the same as in California to keep it here, assuming they'll sell it to us here. And so this is a huge problem from the point of view of energy security within BC, because we do not own the energy down the road. We will have no way of keeping it within the province, nor will we have any way of controlling the price. All of these things are negative from the point of view of the public here, and they speak to the fact that the basic thrust and direction of the energy policy, which is to promote private interests, is not a sound policy, not a good public policy for the province of BC.